In August of 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese torpedo boats engaged U.S. Navy destroyers, prompting swift and decisive retaliatory airstrikes ordered by President Lyndon B. Johnson. That moment challenged assumptions about naval power and regional control. For years, many believed Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, a vital global choke point, was an unshakable strategic advantage, a powerful tool for leverage during delicate ceasefire negotiations. But that perception has now been shattered. Iran's Revolutionary Guard, deploying fast attack boats and drone swarms, had locked onto every vessel attempting to transit this critical maritime corridor, including assets belonging to the U.S. Navy. This aggressive strategy, however, culminated in devastating destruction. Attacking 3 U.S. destroyers that dared to transit from the deadly waters of Hormuz toward Oman proved to be a historic miscalculation for the IRGC. The price of this provocation was extremely heavy. The U.S. military obliterated Iran's most strategic military targets along the Hormuz coastline, along with its attack boats, in a striking air operation. This operation took place during an extremely sensitive period when a ceasefire was hanging by a thread. Everything began at that critical moment on May 7th. Tensions in the Middle East were rising. The U.S. Navy made a highly strategic move to break the lock Iran had placed on the Strait of Hormuz. The goal was not only to protect commercial vessels, but also to break the naval blockade Iran had imposed to close the strait. In this context, the guided missile destroyer USS Truckton was cutting through the waves. This steel giant, which had set sail from Norfolk base, was fully combat-ready. Right behind it was the USS Rafael Peralta. The third ship protecting them was the massive warship USS Mason. These Mayport-based vessels were equipped with advanced air defense systems. These 3 steel giants moved from the Strait of Hormuz toward the Gulf of Oman. Suddenly, red warning lights began flashing on the ship's radar screens. According to CENTCOM statements, hidden launch ramps on the Iranian coast had fired their deadly payloads. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had viewed the U.S. Navy's transit through Hormuz as an opportunity for a ruthless attack. Asymmetric warfare tactics were immediately put into action by the IRGC. Multiple anti-ship missiles were launched from the dark waters of the strait. The sky suddenly filled with Iranian suicide drones. Small, dangerous speedboats tried to swarm around the U.S. ships. These boats were organized like a swarm of bees. Iran's aim was to target billion-dollar U.S. warships with cheap munitions. These small vessels, racing at full speed across the sea surface, aimed to create total chaos. At the same time, kamikaze drones descending from the sky had locked onto the ship's decks. In short, a completely unprovoked wave of attacks had begun. However, U.S. forces did not fall into the trap Iran had tried to set in the critical area between the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. The destroyers' close-in weapon systems immediately responded to the Iranian drones and attack boats. Standard missile systems locked onto aerial targets one after another. The destroyers' guns shredded the IRGC boats on the sea surface within seconds. Then, MH-60 Seahawk helicopters took off from the ships in succession. These helicopters destroyed the threats at their source with air-to-surface missiles. All Iranian threats were instantly eliminated in the air and on the sea. None of the U.S. ships sustained even the slightest damage. President Trump later described the drones falling into the sea in poetic terms, comparing them to the death of butterflies. This swift and complete neutralization of an asymmetric swarm attack is highly significant. Historically, such tactics have aimed to overwhelm conventional defenses through sheer volume and low cost. The U.S. Navy's ability to repel this multi-domain assault without a scratch demonstrates a critical evolution in modern naval warfare capabilities, challenging the long-held belief in the inherent advantage of swarm tactics in confined waters. Only a few hours had passed since Iran's failed attack and the U.S. historic retaliatory operation. As darkness fell that evening, the sky echoed with the roar of U.S. fighter jets. Because the situation in Hormuz was only the tip of the iceberg, this time all the military facilities responsible for Iran's reckless attack were in the crosshairs. Explosions echoed along the shores of Bandar Abbas. Then Qeshm Island surrendered to flames. Facilities in the Sur coastal area were struck one by one. Not only these three main areas, but targets in Bandar Kamir and Minab coastal regions also came under heavy fire. The attack order had come directly from U.S. Central Command headquarters. A massive logistical network stood behind this enormous operation. Open-source intelligence data recorded the extraordinary aerial activity moment by moment. Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates was the heart of the operation. More than 5 refueling aircraft took off simultaneously and appeared on radar. Numerous massive stratotanker aircraft from this base created what was essentially a fuel bridge in the sky. They circled in looping patterns over the Gulf, feeding the fighter jets in the air. These aircraft ensured the operation continued without interruption. Thanks to this massive logistical support in the sky, the fighter jets were able to loiter over their targets for hours. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush, patrolling the Gulf waters, had already launched its deadly birds. The other carrier in the region, the Abraham Lincoln, was also in full support position. Stealth fighter jets locked onto Iranian military targets. Growler electronic warfare jets completely blinded Iranian radars. Iranian air defense systems saw only white noise on their screens. During this process, Super Hornet aircraft tore through the sky. F-35 jets glided over the targets like ghosts. It was even claimed that A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft were kept ready for low-altitude strikes. In short, the skies over Hormuz presented a picture of utter chaos from Tehran's perspective. The scale of this coordinated air operation, involving multiple refueling aircraft and 2 carrier strike groups, is notable. While large-scale air power projection is a U.S. hallmark, the rapid deployment and sustained loitering capability demonstrated here, especially in response to an asymmetric naval attack, signals a significant shift in how conventional forces might respond to and deter future provocations in contested maritime zones. The United States stated that it used no ground forces in this massive strike operation against Iran. It destroyed Iranian command centers, using only precision missiles fired from long range. U.S. Central Command issued a very strong message immediately after the events. This message was a perfect reflection of the Pentagon's cold and calculated war doctrine. CENTCOM officials did not describe the incident as the resumption of war, but emphasized that it was a precision defensive operation targeting military sites. Any attack on warships sailing in international waters directly triggers the right of self-defense. The U.S. military acted precisely under this shield of international law. It was also underlined that the operation targeted only military objectives. U.S. President Donald Trump shook the world with his message shared on social media. The U.S. leader used direct and uncompromising language, pushing the boundaries of military diplomacy. He described watching the Iranian drones fall into the sea in his signature style, saying how enjoyable it was. This tone was actually a key part of the psychological effort to collapse the other side's asymmetric warfare capability. Trump's words, "Just like we knocked them out again today, we'll knock them out a lot harder and a lot more violently in the future if they don't get their deal signed fast," echoed across all news channels. This message clearly implied that the military destruction in Iran from the latest strikes was only a light touch. These words signaled the point where diplomacy had ended. In other words, the Trump administration was demanding that the agreement be signed immediately. So, were the regions selected in this latest U.S. strike against Iran truly the kind that would force the Tehran regime back to the negotiating table? It became clear after this striking operation that the targets were not chosen randomly. The U.S. military had set out to erase Iran's arch defense strategy from the map. The IRGC's 1,609-kilometer coastline had been designed as a complete kill zone. The network woven with islands such as Larak, Siri, and Abu Musa was entirely in the crosshairs. The struck areas were the jugular veins of Iran. This port, the jugular of the Gulf, was the very heart of the Revolutionary Guard's naval legend. Bandar Abbas was not just a port city. It was also the main headquarters of the Iranian Navy, which had been largely destroyed during the war and had lost nearly 150 vessels. Its deep-water ports had served for years as the incubation center for asymmetric warfare tactics. The large frigates Jumran and Sahand were commanded from here. Bandar Abbas was known as the heart of Hormuz. All naval operations of the Revolutionary Guard were managed from this center. But U.S. missiles turned the logistical depots and command centers here to ashes in seconds. The massive missile batteries here were rendered completely inoperable. In particular, the coastal anti-ship missile launch ramps were wiped from the map. The hidden silos of Silkworm and Sunburn missiles were also targeted. The guidance centers for deadly anti-ship missiles, such as the C-801, were located right here. The radars of the SSN-22 Sunburn missiles had been scanning the strait from this point for years. U.S. missiles shredded this massive radar network and launch ramps in seconds. Qeshm Island was a vast military geography that was far more complex. This second target was an even more dangerous point. It was not an ordinary tourist destination. Qeshm, the largest island in the Gulf, covers an area of 1,445 square kilometers. This island, which once welcomed tourists, had been turned into a dark military fortress. It is described as a massive underground missile city hidden beneath the sea. Lethal arsenals lay just a few hundred meters beneath the shores. Kilometers of concrete tunnels dug underground were filled with missiles. These tunnels resembled a giant snake's nest hidden under the sea. There were underground tunnels that completely dominated the strait. It is reported that military assets on this island, which formed the plug of the strait, were targeted and a significant portion was struck. In addition, launch ramps for Shahed 136 kamikaze drones were destroyed with precision strikes. These drones had been waiting in the dark to be launched into the sky. The hidden silos of Ghadir and Nasser 1 missiles were also hit in this operation. Qijar's ballistic missiles were another threat waiting to be launched from these underground passages. Precision-guided U.S. bombs permanently sealed the entrances of these underground tunnels with pinpoint strikes. Hidden radar bases overlooking the Gulf waters were completely destroyed by JDAM bombs. The Iranian military, which had used the island like a stationary aircraft carrier, suffered a major shock. The source of the direct threats to U.S. ships was exactly here. The fall of this island fundamentally shook Iran's control over the strait. The Sirik region was the newest and most critical link in Iran's asymmetric defense chain. This third and final stop was a naval base opened in 2020. Shahed Rabari Naval Base is the Revolutionary Guard's eastern gateway to the ocean. This new naval base, which controlled the eastern side of the strait, was the most important pillar of Iran's asymmetric power. It served as an early detection blind spot for ships approaching from the west. Every ship approaching the strait from the Gulf of Oman was first caught by this base's radars. This was where Iran's early warning systems and intelligence nodes were most concentrated. The Revolutionary Guard used this base to monitor all shipping traffic like the palm of its hand. But the coastal defense systems and radar nodes in this base area were hunted down one by one in the latest U.S. strikes. Fighter jets likely blinded these intelligence nodes by striking them individually. This region turned into a blind spot for Iran, no longer poses a threat to U.S. ships. The most vital links in the asymmetric defense chain were severed, and the IRGC's giant eyes watching Hormuz were completely gouged out. In the aftermath of all these massive strikes and the military losses in the targeted Iranian regions, there was great panic and confusion within the Tehran regime. Iranian commanders, whose communication with command centers had been cut, were essentially flying blind. At first, the Tehran administration looked for signs that these devastating strikes had been carried out by the United Arab Emirates. This was because of the massive missile barrage directed at UAE territory just a few days earlier. Just 2 days prior, a massive missile rain had hit the Emirates on May 4th and 5th. 12 ballistic missiles had been fired at the Emirates, along with 3 cruise missiles and numerous drones. Major fires had broken out in the Fujairah industrial zone, and there were casualties. The fires in the Emirates Petroleum Industrial Zone had worried the whole world. Iran had denied all these attacks, claiming they were baseless. The Tehran administration had probably thought that the massive explosions from the latest U.S. strikes were a retaliation coming through the UAE. The UAE Defense Ministry simply watched the events in silence. But once the flames died down, it became painfully clear that the power they faced was directly the U.S. Navy. When the truth emerged, Iranian state media quickly launched a propaganda effort. Outlets like Fars and Tasnim tried to portray the explosions as routine air defense exercises. Iranian media was most likely trying to shout fake victory slogans to the public. Although they claimed civilian areas had been hit, they presented no evidence. In reality, only strategic military infrastructure had been destroyed. The global impact of this critical strike operation is far more intense than imagined. Behind all this military activity lies a very deep diplomatic message. An extraordinary diplomatic chess game is being played behind the scenes of the war. Diplomatic traffic had never stopped since the beginning of the crisis. The fragile 2-week ceasefire reached in April was actually a complete calm before the storm. Tehran had brought its own 14-point plan to the table, filled with unbelievable and extreme demands. It had demanded the complete withdrawal of American forces from the region and war reparations. In addition, Tehran demanded the return of frozen assets and billions of dollars in war compensation. It had even demanded an entirely new mechanism under its own control for the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump had immediately rejected these excessive demands and thrown them off the table. Trump's response was a very clear and extremely lethal counter-offer. Just a few days earlier, the United States had presented Iran with a 1-page Memorandum of Understanding. This document, secretly delivered through Pakistani mediation, was essentially a surrender agreement. This offer was the last exit route for the permanent end of the war. This 1-page Memorandum of Understanding was Trump's final honorable ticket out for Iran. It aimed to launch a 30-day negotiation process. The immediate opening of the Strait of Hormuz was a required condition. The complete restraint of proxy groups and militants was one of the most important items on the table. It demanded the sharp cutoff of funding for all militant networks in the region and proxy forces like Hezbollah. The complete halt of the nuclear program was also among the demands. Iran was in the process of evaluating this vital offer. A final response was expected within 24 hours. Pakistani diplomats were focused on the definitive answer that would come from Tehran. However, firing on U.S. destroyers in the Strait completely changed the balance on the table. Washington's harsh retaliation was, in fact, an implicit enforcement of acceptance of the ceasefire offer presented. It delivered a powerful message. If you do not sit at the table, we will erase all your military assets from the map. The Trump administration is not giving an inch from its strategy of achieving peace through strength. One last chance was given to accept the agreement and comply with ceasefire terms. Otherwise, Iran's military power will be completely wiped from the geography. Trump's desire for unconditional surrender is becoming more evident with every passing second. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt's statements clearly summarize the seriousness of the situation. In the press briefing, Leavitt's words sent a chill through the air. She stated that if Iran does not understand it has been militarily defeated, it will be hit harder than it has ever been hit before. These words are seen as the clearest proof that Trump is not bluffing and is ready to unleash hell. This tough stance completely narrows Iran's room for maneuver. The explicit linkage between military strikes and diplomatic demands, particularly the surrender agreement, delivered via a third party, marks a departure from traditional diplomatic engagement. This aggressive form of coercive diplomacy, where military action directly enforces negotiation terms, suggests a new, more confrontational paradigm in international relations, moving beyond mere signaling to direct enforcement. These waters, which carry 20% of the world's petroleum trade, are now at the center of an irreversible power struggle. Commercial vessels trying to advance in the massive shadow of warships face great risks. Tanker insurance premiums have already shot up like missiles. In the corridors of the United Nations, new sanctions drafts led by America and Bahrain are circulating. Global shipping chains on China's bypass routes have suffered deep wounds from this crisis. Japan's vital energy supply lines are also under great risk due to the blockade in this strait. It should not be forgotten that Saudi Arabia also has a third route bypassing Hormuz. All these global logistics networks are locked to the fate of a single strait. For this reason, the United States wants to uproot the crisis at its source. In this context, Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine has been officially collapsed by America's long-range precision strikes. What happened is not just a battle, but the very rewriting of the fate of global energy security. Iran will either sit at the table or helplessly watch the complete disappearance of its asymmetric defense chain in Hormuz, because this historic U.S. operation has burned all of Iran's cards at the ceasefire table. Will the Iranian leadership bow to Trump's latest and final warning and sit at the table? Or will the IRGC once again seize decision-making authority from Tehran and continue dragging the country toward a total destruction scenario in which it completely loses the Strait of Hormuz? We will continue to follow these developments closely.